You already know everything is temporary. You've known it since you were a child. And yet, there's still that moment when something ends. A relationship, a job, a version of yourself you'd gotten used to. And it hits you like it was never supposed to happen. That gap between what you know and what you feel, that's what this video is about. And the answer has been sitting in plain sight for 2,500 years. In the autumn of 161 AD, a man named Marcus Aurelius became the most powerful person on earth. He was 40 years old. He had not asked for the job. The Roman Emperor Antoninus Pius had died that morning, and by custom, by law, by the weight of 20 years of preparation, the throne passed to Marcus. He had been preparing for this role since he was 17, trained in philosophy, in law, in the machinery of empire. By all accounts, he was ready, and by all accounts, from the day he took power, he began dismantling himself. Not visibly, not in the Senate, not in his judgments on the campaigns he spent the next 2 decades fighting. In a private journal, kept in Greek, not Latin, as if he needed a different language to say the things he couldn't say in his official life, he wrote about that day of coronation later, not with triumph, not with relief. He wrote, "I could be leaving life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think." This was not a man having a crisis. This was a man who had been writing in his private journal for years, possibly decades, about the same problem you and I have. Over those years, he filled page after page, trying to convince himself of something he already believed was true, that everything passes, that nothing holds, that the legions, the Senate, the marble buildings of Rome, the people he loved, the enemies he feared, all of it was moving. He watched 3 of his children die in childhood. He governed an empire through plague, the Antonine Plague, which killed an estimated 5 million people across 20 years. He spent most of his reign in military camps, sleeping in a tent, reading philosophy by oil lamp, while riding home to his wife and children in Rome. He knew, better than almost anyone alive, what impermanence looked like at scale, and he still couldn't quite get it to stick. He wrote it down hundreds of times, in hundreds of different ways. Time is a river made of the events which happen, and a violent stream. As soon as a thing has been seen, it is carried away. He wrote that, and then he wrote it again, and then a slightly different version of the same idea. 3 pages later, a man who governed an empire of 70 million people, who had read every philosopher Greece ever produced, who had spent his entire adult life training his mind, and he still woke up some mornings and had to start the argument over from the beginning. There's a word in Pali, the ancient language of early Buddhist texts, that names what Marcus was circling. Anicca. It's usually translated as impermanence, but that translation loses something. It sounds like a concept, something you can agree with, file away, and then never think about again. The Pali word has more weight to it. Anicca is not a philosophical position. It's a description of how reality is structured, at every level, in every moment, without exception. The Buddha used it in his very last words. Not be kind to each other, not meditate daily. His final sentence, as recorded in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, was, "All conditioned things are impermanent. Work out your salvation with diligence. First breath, last words, the whole of the teaching, bookended by this single observation. Marcus Aurelius never encountered Buddhism. He died in 180 AD in a military camp on the Danube frontier, having spent 40 years in a running argument with his own mind about the nature of change. Buddhism had been quietly working on the same problem for 600 years before Marcus wrote a single word, and it arrived at something he never quite managed to reach. That's what I want to trace with you today. Think about the last time something ended that you weren't ready for. Not a catastrophe, not a death. Something smaller and stranger than that. The project you'd worked on for 2 years, wrapped up, moved into the archive folder, and never mentioned again. You close your laptop, you make a cup of tea. You stand in the kitchen for a moment, not quite knowing what to do with your hands. That feeling, that specific blankness, is not grief, but it's not nothing either, or the friendship that slowly stopped being what it was. Not because of a fight, not because of a betrayal, just because your lives quietly drifted until one day you realized you hadn't spoken in 8 months, and you think about texting. You even open the thread. You read the last message sent 14 months ago, something trivial, and then you close it again. Because somehow it's become strange, and you don't know exactly when that happened. Or something even smaller, the version of yourself that existed 3 years ago, the particular combination of concerns, habits, confidence, and confusion that added up to you in that specific season. Just gone. Not replaced by something better. Not replaced by something worse. Just replaced. And there's a particular texture to that feeling. It's not grief exactly. Grief has a clear object, a person, a loss you can name. This is more like reaching for something on a shelf and finding empty air. You didn't know you were going to reach for it. You didn't know you'd needed it. And now it's not there. The rational response, of course, is to remind yourself that this is how things work, that all of it was always temporary, that you knew this going in. You've probably done that. Most people do, and it helps for about 11 seconds. And then the hand reaches for the shelf again. Here's what makes this strange. The gap between knowing something is temporary and actually feeling it as temporary. That gap is not a character flaw. It's not a sign of weakness or poor thinking. It's what your mind is built to do. Psychologists who study memory and prediction have a name for one part of this: the end of history illusion. In 2013, researchers at Harvard asked thousands of people a deceptively simple pair of questions. First, how much have you changed in the last 10 years? People answered honestly, quite a lot, significantly, more than I expected. Then, how much will you change in the next 10 years? And almost everyone, regardless of age, regardless of what they'd just said, answered, not much. I'm mostly done now. I know who I am. The same person who had just acknowledged profound change across a decade now couldn't imagine the decade ahead holding anything similar. The researchers called this the mistaken belief that who we are today is who we will be tomorrow. But notice what it actually reveals. It's not that we're stupid. It's that the present always feels permanent from the inside. Right now, sitting where you are, the particular weight of your current concerns. The thing you're trying to solve at work, the person you're thinking about, The version of yourself you're building or protecting. All of it feels like the stable ground, the thing underneath all the other things. And every previous version of you felt exactly the same way. That's the gap Marcus kept falling into. That's the gap the Buddhist tradition spent centuries trying to understand. Not why change happens, but why, after all this time, it keeps catching us by surprise. The teaching, the Buddha's framework for this, is more precise than the Harvard study by about 2,500 years. He identified 3 marks that characterize all conditioned existence. The 3 tilakkhana. The first is anicca, impermanence. The second is dukkha, the suffering or friction that arises from impermanence. The third is anatta, the absence of a fixed, permanent self. These 3 are not separate observations. They're linked. Anicca causes dukkha, specifically because of anatta. The reason impermanence hurts is that we're trying to hold permanent things with a self that is itself impermanent. It's not just that the river is moving. The bank you're standing on is moving too. You just can't feel the bank moving. The Buddha described the ordinary human experience as something like a person standing in a fast-moving river, grabbing at the water flowing past, trying to hold particular shapes in place. This relationship, this status, this feeling, this version of myself, and being baffled again and again by the water's failure to cooperate. What the teacher, Ajahn Chah, a Thai forest monk who died in 1992, called making a problem where there is no problem. He had a glass he was particularly fond of. He used it every day. He said, "To me, this glass is already broken. I enjoy it. I drink out of it. It holds my water admirably. But when the wind blows it off the shelf and it breaks, I say, of course. When my disciples bring me a beautiful glass and I hold it up in the light, I think, already broken. Already broken. Not as pessimism, not as a way of refusing to care about things, as a practice of seeing what's actually true before the glass falls. There's a brain mechanism underneath this that's worth understanding. Neuroscientists who study prediction and expectation use a phrase, prediction error. When the world doesn't match what your brain expected, there's a signal, a brief, sharp jolt of attention. Not pain, not pleasure, just, this is different from what I thought. The stronger the prediction, the more certain you were. The stronger the signal when reality diverges. And here's what your brain does with something stable. It stops predicting. When something has been the same for 6 months, for a year, for 5 years, your brain doesn't keep checking. It files it under permanent. Not because it believes philosophically that it won't change, but because checking takes energy and nothing has changed yet. So why bother? This is efficient. It works well for most things. And it means that when the thing finally changes, the relationship, the job, the health, the version of yourself, your brain receives it as a violation, not just a transition, a violation, something that wasn't supposed to happen. Marcus Aurelius, writing in a tent by lamplight on the Danube frontier, was trying to manually override this mechanism, reminding himself again and again of what his nervous system kept forgetting, that the empire he was running would one day be dust, that the people he loved would be gone, that he himself would be gone, not to make himself miserable, to make himself present. This is the open loop I want to close before we go further, because there's a version of this teaching that sounds like, accept that everything ends, so you can be stoically numb about losing things. Enjoy nothing too much. Hold everything loosely. Keep your emotional distance. I've met people who use this framing as armor, who've absorbed just enough Buddhism to justify never fully committing to anything, a relationship, a project, a belief, because I know it won't last. That's not a nikka. That's a kind of preemptive grief. That's really just fear with a philosophical costume. Shunryu Suzuki, the Japanese Zen teacher who helped bring Buddhism to America in the 1960s, put it this way. He was teaching a group of students in San Francisco, and someone asked him, "If everything is impermanent, why does anything matter?" He paused for a long time. Then he said, "It is because things are impermanent that we love them. If you were not going to die, if your child was not going to grow up and leave, if this moment were not going to end, you would not be paying attention right now. Impermanence isn't the reason things don't matter. It's the reason they matter at all. Think about the last conversation you had with someone you love, when you knew it was the last time you'd see them for a while. You were there, fully there. You noticed things you wouldn't normally notice. The way they laughed, what their hands were doing, the specific quality of light in the room. You probably didn't check your phone. That attention, that particular quality of presence, it didn't come from the relationship being permanent. It came from you knowing in that moment that it wasn't. This is what Ajahn Chah was pointing at. With the glass he was fond of, he didn't drink from it less. He didn't hold it more carefully, afraid of dropping it. He didn't put it on a high shelf where it would be safe. He used it every day, in full view of its fragility. And when it broke, when the wind finally knocked it off the shelf, he didn't experience the shock of betrayal. He experienced something cleaner. Of course, not resignation, not indifference, a kind of clear-eyed recognition. The thing that was temporary being temporary. That knowing, when it finally moves from the head into the body, changes the texture of the experience, not by removing the pain of loss, but by removing the added layer of shock, the layer that says, this wasn't supposed to happen. Because it was. It always was. You just couldn't quite feel that until now. So why doesn't knowing this fix it? Why could Marcus Aurelius fill an entire journal with this understanding and still need to write it again on the next page? Here's what the Buddhist tradition says. There's a difference between knowing something and seeing it. In Pali, the word for wisdom, panya, doesn't mean information you've acquired. It means perception that has been directly verified by experience, not something you agree with, something you've looked at clearly and seen to be true. Most of us have the first kind of knowing. We've read about impermanence. We've agreed with it intellectually. We might even have nodded along to exactly what I've been saying. And none of that touches the place where the actual reaction lives. The reaction that makes you check the phone again after you've already checked it. That makes you replay the conversation for the fourth time, trying to find the version where it comes out differently. That makes you feel, at some level, that this particular thing, this loss, this change, is somehow more permanent than the last three things you lost. That impulse to replay, that specific quality of attention, that keeps returning to the thing you wish were different. Notice, it's not passive, it's active. The mind is doing something, trying to solve a problem that is not solvable. By the method, the mind keeps trying. You cannot think your way back to the thing that was. You cannot argue the timeline into a different shape. And yet, the Buddhist word for this habitual reactivity is sankhara, the deep grooves of conditioned response that the mind runs in before the conscious mind has any say. These grooves were not laid down by a philosophy class. They were laid down by 30, 40, 50 years of experiencing change as something that happens to a fixed self, a self that has an expectation of continuity, that woke up today assuming the things that were true yesterday would still be true this morning, because they usually are, and the mind is optimized for usually. Knowing that impermanence is true is the beginning of the work, not the work itself. There's a second person worth meeting here, someone who understood what Marcus couldn't quite get to. In 1953, a young monk named Chogyam Trungpa entered a traditional 3-year retreat in Tibet. He was 13 years old. By the time he was 20, the Chinese army had occupied Tibet. His monastery had been destroyed, and he was walking, literally walking, over the Himalayas into India with a group of refugees. He lost people on that journey. He watched the life he had been trained for dismantle itself in real time. He arrived in India, then England, then eventually America, and spent the next 3 decades teaching to people who had no frame of reference for what he'd survived. What struck his students was not his equanimity. It was his engagement. He wept. He laughed. He made terrible decisions and owned them. He was, by all accounts, fully in his life, not hovering above it at a safe philosophical distance. When students asked how he managed to care deeply about things while knowing they wouldn't last, he said something that sounds simple until you sit with it long enough. He said, "The bad news is you're falling through the air. The good news is there's no ground." No ground. Not, "The fall is fine, you'll land softly." Not, "Nothing matters, so nothing can hurt you." But, "The thing you're afraid of, the impact, the crash, is itself a construction. There is no fixed place you're falling toward. Just movement all the way down." Marcus Aurelius kept reaching for the ground, kept trying to find the stable thing, the philosophy, the discipline, the perfect formulation that would finally make change feel okay. Trungpa's teaching is stranger than that, and, in the end, more honest. What if the discomfort of impermanence isn't a problem to be solved, but a sensation to be experienced with more accuracy? This matters especially for people who are further into a life. There's a particular exhaustion that accumulates somewhere in your 30s and 40s and beyond, not from a single loss, but from the quiet arithmetic of changes. The person you were in your 20s, the dream you revised at 35, the relationship that ended differently than you planned, the body that started to become a negotiation. Each one processed, more or less. Each one survived. And still, somehow, the next change hits you with the same surprise as the first, as if the previous ones were preparation for a test that kept being rescheduled. Here's what the tradition actually says about this: that accumulated experience, the weight of all the things you've already moved through is not evidence that the practice isn't working. It's the practice. A 22-year-old can understand anicca intellectually with the same ease as someone who is 55. But the 55-year-old has something the 22-year-old doesn't. They have a body full of evidence. Real evidence, lived evidence. Of things they were certain would last, that didn't. Of versions of themselves they were convinced were final, that turned out to be provisional. Of losses that felt unsurvivable, that were in fact survived. That accumulated evidence is not baggage. It's the only material the practice actually works with. You cannot do this particular work with a clean slate. You can only do it with the specific, textured, sometimes painful, sometimes ridiculous life you have actually lived, which means that the person reading this, who has already been through a few things, who has the particular tiredness that comes from a life that didn't stay the shape you expected, is not behind the curve. They're standing exactly where the work begins, what the Buddhist tradition says, and what Marcus, in his best moments, intuited, is that the person who has lost things and kept showing up has already demonstrated something remarkable. Not that loss is fine, but that they are larger than the losses, even if it doesn't feel that way at 2 a.m. Even if the same question keeps surfacing in the same quiet moments. The question is not the problem. The question is the practice. This matters especially for people who are further into a life. There's a particular exhaustion that accumulates somewhere in your 30s and 40s and beyond, not from a single loss, but from the quiet arithmetic of changes. The person you were in your 20s, the dream you revised at 35, the relationship that ended differently than you planned, the body that started to become a negotiation. Each one processed, more or less. Each one survived. And still, somehow, the next change hits you with the same surprise as the first, as if the previous ones were preparation for a test that kept being rescheduled. Here's what the tradition actually says about this. That accumulated experience, the weight of all the things you've already moved through, is not evidence that the practice isn't working. It's the practice. A 22-year-old can understand anicca intellectually with the same ease as someone who is 55. But the 55-year-old has something the 22-year-old doesn't. They have a body full of evidence, real evidence, lived evidence, of things they were certain would last, that didn't. Of versions of themselves they were convinced were final, that turned out to be provisional, of losses that felt unsurvivable, that were in fact survived. That accumulated evidence is not baggage. It's the only material the practice actually works with. You cannot do this particular work with a clean slate. You can only do it with the specific, textured, sometimes painful, sometimes ridiculous life you have actually lived. Which means that the person reading this, who has already been through a few things, who has the particular tiredness that comes from a life that didn't stay the shape you expected, is not behind the curve. They're standing exactly where the work begins. What the Buddhist tradition says, and what Marcus, in his best moments, intuited, is that the person who has lost things and kept showing up has already demonstrated something remarkable. Not that loss is fine, but that they are larger than the losses, even if it doesn't feel that way at 2 a.m. Even if the same question keeps surfacing in the same quiet moments. The question is not the problem. The question is the practice. Marcus Aurelius never quite made it there. He kept writing, right up to the end. He died in 180 AD in a military camp on the Danube, probably of plague. He was 58 years old. His journal, which he had written for himself, never intending it to be published, was preserved almost by accident, passed hand to hand through the centuries, copied by monks who may not have fully understood what they were preserving. And in those pages, you can track something that almost no document in human history can show you. A man getting better at something without ever finishing. The early entries are more desperate, the arguments more labored, the repetitions more obvious. The later entries are quieter, shorter, the same ideas, returned to not because he hasn't understood them, but because he has, and he's checking in, like someone who has stopped arguing with the weather and now simply looks out the window each morning to see what it is. The man who spent 40 years trying to convince himself that everything passes, left behind a book that has not passed. 1,700 years later, it's still in print, still being read by people who can't quite get the same obvious thing to stick. There's something almost funny about that. A man who kept writing "everything is temporary" into a journal that turned out to be immortal, and something that might be the most important lesson in the whole text. The practice is not a problem you solve. It's a condition you live with increasing skill, for as long as you have. Marcus didn't graduate. He didn't arrive somewhere. He just kept noticing, kept writing it down, kept waking up and checking whether the understanding had settled any deeper. Some mornings it had, some mornings it hadn't, and he kept showing up anyway. That's not failure. That's what the work actually looks like. There's one small thing I want to offer you before the end of this. Not a technique, not a meditation. Something simpler. The next time something shifts, something you were holding without realizing you were holding it, before you move into the usual sequence of explaining, analyzing, adjusting, there's a moment just after the shift where you can simply notice what you're actually experiencing, not narrate it, not evaluate it, not compare it to previous times, just something that was is no longer. And there is a particular texture to that moment. That texture is not a problem. It's not evidence that something went wrong. It's what anicca feels like from the inside. Marcus spent 40 years trying to feel that directly, rather than just know it abstractly. I don't think he fully succeeded. I don't think I have either. But somewhere in those pages, written by a man who governed an empire by day and argued with impermanence alone by lamplight at night, there is a record of someone doing the work honestly, not claiming to have arrived, just sitting with the glass, knowing it's already broken, drinking from it anyway. That's the beginning. That's the whole of it, really. The next time we meet, we're going to go one layer deeper. Because knowing that change is real and understanding why it hurts, those are two entirely different things. There's a mechanism the Buddhist tradition identified that explains not just that we suffer from impermanence, but precisely how we manufacture that suffering ourselves. It has a name. It's not comfortable. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. If something in what we talked about today landed, stay with it this week. Not the idea, the texture. One moment when something is clearly temporary, A cup of coffee, a drive, a good feeling after a walk. And see if you can hold both things at once, the enjoyment and the knowing.